Hi, thank you for tuning into my presentation. I'm going to be exploring historical dietary trends and chronic disease in the United States. I'm going to begin with a little bit of background on the industrialization of food and ultra-processed options. So during the mid-19th century and early 20th century, there were rapid changes in agriculture that increased efficiency and lowered production costs. But this unfortunately had negative consequences on the ecological health of the earth and also the public health and chronic disease state that we are now experiencing as a society. Some of the techniques used in agriculture were crop specialization or monoagriculture, which is where a farmer would almost just like scale up the production and grow just one particular type of crop or one livestock animal instead of a variety, which had typically been practiced prior to this point. And also the use of agriculture machines that were more efficient, and also the use of antibiotics in livestock and pesticides on crops. Interestingly enough, around the same time, ultra-processed foods were developed, and they became popular and in demand after World War I to combat malnutrition and disease after the influenza pandemic and to feed military forces. And because of their high caloric content, this was very, it really met the need, the public need of the masses, but unfortunately it had negative consequences in the future. And while processed and preserved foods have existed for centuries, and processing food, the nature of processing food isn't always necessarily damaging to the health. The ultra-processed foods that we see today contain artificial components such as gums and stabilizers and syrups that were, we had never really experienced or seen the long-term health impacts that these types of artificial components would have on our health. So those, for example, are found in soda, fast food, candy, and snacks. But processed food or preserved foods such as olive oil, flour, cheese, and noodles are typically the types of foods that were processed historically. And these foods have a high caloric content. They usually contain refined sugars, unhealthy fats, but are often low in micronutrients and essential vitamins. So the ratio of caloric content to micronutrient and vitamin content is very disproportionate in ultra-processed foods. So as we begin to lay the framework for the industrialized food system and its development into the early 20th century, as well as the demand for ultra-processed foods, we can begin to understand the standard American diet. And although the diet of individuals within the American culture is very diverse due to socioeconomic factors, cultural factors, local customs and eating traditions, because America is historically very diverse, we begin to see that ultra-processed foods and processed foods are very normalized and incorporated into many different and diverse diets, and that in a holistic health model, the diet is one of the main pillars and preventative measures or treatment measures for chronic conditions. So this led to the rise in obesity, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, stroke, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndromes and cancers, and perhaps neurological conditions. And often we see that these conditions occur in tandem, or one of the conditions, such as obesity, can increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. And this has major public health consequences on individuals, communities, and just for to incorporate a fiscal figure, we see that 90% of the nation's $4.5 trillion in annual healthcare expenditures are for people with chronic and mental health conditions. So these are very taxing and financially burdening conditions on the financial health of our nation. As we begin to explore some of the major chronic diseases in the United States and its prevalence and impact on our population, we can also explore some of the social determinants of health, which can help us to understand what somebody's environment per se is composed of. And we know that people that are in racial ethnic minority groups that are a part of an aging population have a lower income, lower education, lack of access to housing, transportation, and healthcare, all experience one or more chronic diseases, and this can impact entire communities or families or really an entire population of people. And the visual that's on the right here shows that there are different levels at which somebody is addressing a chronic disease. The inner layer being individual level, managing a condition. The next being community and institutional levels. So having a support system, and then a socioeconomic status and other supportive factors or risk factors for a chronic disease, as well as like system and policy level changes, and improving healthcare and access to preventative and treatment care for chronic diseases. As we can see here, there is a graph that on the x-axis displays the years 1940 through 2020, and we can see that the rate of chronic disease prevalence in America is at 7.5% in what seems to be 1935, and skyrockets all the way up to 60% in the year 2020, and is on a trajectory to continue to increase. And as we begin to observe some of the trends in common and prevalent chronic conditions within the United States, we can also observe some of the ecological changes that are taking place. Of course, the main one being the rising levels of CO2 in our atmosphere. And from a nutritional perspective, we understand now that the nutritional value of food, fruits and vegetables and crops, is declining in the last 50 years with a decrease in nutrients such as calcium, iron, and vitamins A and C. And this often attributed to intensive farming where crops aren't the soil isn't given time to rest and replenish because efficiency is ultimately valued more than the natural resources that are required to grow food. And the use of pesticides and herbicides is also being criticized because it does not follow a natural, a cyclical nature that farming had once been practiced as. And with this, we can also see that common nutrient deficiencies in people are iron, iodine, vitamin A, D, and calcium. So there a connection between the nutrients being depleted in our crops and the nutrient deficiencies that we see in the population. The second visual I have here is about the negative effects of industrial farming. And obviously there's a lot of controversy around diet being a lifestyle choice, but we can see that the origins of industrialized farming often led to a monopoly of sorts in the limited options, the way a consumer is able to engage with their food system. So we see like the two pillars here are factory farm and industrial crop production. And we can see that there are negative consequences on these 6 categories: environment, animal welfare, public health, food workers, farmers, and local economies. And that the bridge between these two is consolidated corporate control, and it's kind of also being bridged by political protections. So we begin to understand that industrialized farming is a very politically driven force, and that it is damaging and worsening the chronic health conditions that Americans are experiencing today. And that concludes the exploration of historical dietary trends and chronic diseases. This is my reference list, and thank you for listening.